There's been an awful lot of controversy about this race down the West Coast, but the West Coast to us is a well-charted coast now. It has a lot of natural beauty there that you don't get on any other coast, and we can't see any difference racing down the West Coast to racing up the Victorian coast or New South Wales coast or any other coast.
The Westcoaster has come of age. For 3 days, 24 boats battled their way down Tasmania's west coast in the worst conditions since the race's inception. Dawn, 26 December. At the marinas of the various yacht clubs, activity is gaining momentum as crews steadily and methodically stow their gear. On Mary Blair, space is at a premium. Only the most essential gear is taken on board. The 53-foot Hobart-based Anaconda had curious eyes looking it over as crew members carefully check and bag the sails. With only a few hours to the gun, final adjustments are made to Meetang's gear. An old campaigner of ocean racing, this is her first West Coaster. Across the bay, the tempo is increasing. Musicians arrive to play their part in the start. The 42-foot Monsoon, skippered by John Atwood, sails past. Mary Blair, owned and skippered by Fred Short, sets a Helsal. From Hobart, the 34-foot Hornet slips past the smallest entrant, the 29-foot Carina. On the giant 72-foot Helsal, a few extra emergency supplies are taken on board. This is Helsal's second trip. She failed to break Minna's record last year due to light winds, but still got line honours. The first stage in the West Coaster is aptly named Cock of the Bay. Yachts participating in the West Coaster and also the Queenscliff to Devonport race compete against all comers for the chance to be first across the bay. With the start a few minutes off, the action begins. Tony Fisher and his 20-man crew will have all stops out this time in an attempt to smash the record. Within minutes of the start, Helsal and Gretel, the ex-America's Cup challenger, slip away from the rest of the fleet and settle down on a fast starboard tack. Tony Fisher's crew are extracting every bit of speed. Pulling 12 knots and with sails straining, she slowly begins to overtake Gretel. A wave hits the Genoa and disaster strikes. Tony Fisher has anxious moments as the crew try valiantly to change the sails. This misfortune has allowed Gretel to slip away and open up a handy lead. Off Helsal's port quarter, Mary Blair is moving well. Fred Short and his young crew have the boat trimmed to perfection. Helsal is still trying to get moving and Tony Fisher is getting anxious. The crew work hard with a staysail and jib to replace the Genoa. Helsal begins to slice the water. Under careful trim, Helsal's speed is soon often in excess of 13 knots. With Dave Lawson at the wheel, Helsal slowly makes up the leeway between her and Gretel. And within sight of the West Channel light, Helsal draws a beam. A few minutes later, Helsal has the Cock of the Bay race well and truly in her keeping. For For the crews of the Westcoaster yachts, it's a welcome break before getting down to the real reason they're all here. The 500-mile race down the west coast of Tasmania to Hobart. Queenscliff, a popular holiday resort nestled inside the heads on the western side of Port Phillip Bay, becomes a haven for the yachts as they wait for the tide. All too soon, the rest is over and activity returns to the yachts. With 4 retirements so far, 24 yachts will face the starter's gun. With her mainsail reefed, Helsal hoists her jib. The winds are just what she needs for a fast passage and a chance at the record. Already there are signs of the weather deteriorating as the wind rises to 30 knots and the rip turns on the conditions for which it's notorious. Skipper Bob Gear has Hornets sailing well. Rouseabout, a 30-footer, cuts in front of Mary Blair on starboard tack in her quest for first out of the heads. Helsal and Anaconda have a close duel, missing each other by a few feet as they try valiantly to get a clear break. For Helsal, the drama of the morning was to carry through as the mainsail halyard snapped and left the big boat wallowing in the swells. As it was impossible to send a man up the mast, Tony Fisher elected to keep going. A foresail rig was set and the flying footpath headed south. The 48-foot Meton surged past Milana on her way through the rip. Rouseabout, racing to Hobart to compete in the Australian half-ton titles, disappears behind the confused swells as she beats her way through the steadily increasing southwesterly gale to be first out of the heads. The radio relay vessel Royal Oak, owned and skippered by Ted Gray, was making slow and heavy progress out into Bass Strait. At dawn on the 27th, Mary Blair was placed just south of King Island. With her was the Tasmanian-owned Anaconda and the late entry from Western Australia, Imogene. Throughout the night, she was battered continuously by enormous seas rolling in from the west. With visibility poor and no land to be seen, Fred Short is navigating by dead reckoning. As scheduled, the radio relay vessel Royal Oak pulled into Grassy on King Island to take on extra fuel in readiness for the long haul down the west coast. During the 27th, Helsal fought her way down the coast. The seas were huge, sometimes attaining heights of 30 feet. The winds blew incessantly from the southwest, often reaching 60 knots. The crews were fatigued, and even some of the old hands suffered the horrible fate of seasickness. Just before midday on the 28th, Helsal closed with the coast at Port Davey. For most of the trip, she stood 20 miles out to sea in an attempt to find some long swells and smoother water. Approaching Southwest Cape, the thought of rounding Australia's Land's End was exhilarating. With only 100 miles to go, thoughts of a steady bed, dry clothes and a hot meal were uppermost in their minds. For 2 days, the crews had suffered at the hands of the southwesterly gales, and now, with renewed vigour, the last leg was about to start. At 1400 hours, Helsal rounded Southwest Cape and surged towards Matsaika Island. "70 minutes after rounding Southwest Cape, Helsal stormed past Matsaika. With the big boat averaging 12 knots, Mewstone Rock, a haven for the Southern Ocean albatross, is soon swept aside. Late in the afternoon of the 28th, Helsal, still without a mainsail, was for the first time on port tack. Aircraft from Hobart, taking the opportunity to accurately pinpoint the leaders, command an excellent view of the yachts as they surge across the Southern Ocean. Helsal at this stage was only 3 miles ahead of the West Australian entry Imogene. The 44-foot sloop, with her speeds off the clock, was taking full advantage of the conditions. Planing down the swells, she blew out 2 spinnakers before she gave up the chase and dropped back. Mary Blair, in company with Anaconda, was some 30 miles astern of the leaders and enjoying a fast run. The winds were still gusting to 40 knots, and at times the swells were 30 feet from trough to peak. With Helsal approaching Tasman Head, it was decided to risk hoisting the main. 2 light spinnaker halyards were used, and in the lee of Bruny Island, Helsal was set for the final 40 miles to Hobart. As usual, the fickle winds of the Derwent had yet to be overcome. Helsal had run into a hole, and for 45 minutes she sat there while Imogene, reveling in the light conditions, ghosted to within a few hundred yards. Fortunately for Helsal, the wind rose, and at 2:18 in the morning she crossed the line to take line honours in the 500-mile Westcoaster. For Helsal's crew, the tension and tiredness vanished. With a small group of well-wishers to greet them, the crew prepared themselves for the inevitable parties that were to follow. For Dr. Tony Fisher, the slashing of 8 hours off the existing record was a personal triumph. By doing so, it gave Helsal her 8th ocean racing record, and all but 40 miles without a mainsail. 18 minutes later, Imogene, who nearly caused the upset of the race, crossed the line. Anaconda finished 3rd, and 2 hours later, Mary Blair and her young crew tied up at North Pier. Eight hours later, the Tasmanian-owned Hornet storms up the river to cross the line and take 2nd place in Division 2. Close on Hornet's tail is Ariadne of Melbourne. She finished out of a place but managed to hold down 11th overall. Later in the afternoon, Milana, in company with Sea Jade, coasts towards the line. Another late arrival is the 29-foot Carina, placed 12th overall. As in other years, the Sydney-Hobart yachts arrive at the same time, and it isn't long before a carnival atmosphere presides over the Hobart docks. Once again, Hobart has become the centre of yachting activities in Australia over the Christmas-New Year break. Every year sees both races increasing in popularity, and with the excellent sponsorship now being offered, Hobart is assured of retaining this reputation.